As urban land usage increases, numerous wildlife species are subjected to reduced quality of life and habitat fragmentation. Frogs are especially impacted by habitat fragmentation due to their biphasic nature as amphibians, requiring both freshwater and terrestrial wetland habitats to survive. An estimated 40% of all amphibious species are threatened by developments within 1 kilometer of their breeding grounds. Callahan et al., 2021. This is my study, Impacts of Urbanization on Amphibian Habitat Expanse, and I sought to supplement information regarding the impact of urbanization in wetlands by analyzing the number of frogs observed across several years and whether or not they change in proximity to urban land use zones. A bit of background, according to a study conducted by the IPBES in 2019, humans had modified some 75% of land and 66% of available ocean area, which at the time was a conservative estimate, and that number has only grown due to a lack of any sort of mitigating policy, or strong mitigating policy, rather. And humans were threatening up to 1 million different species of plants and animals with extinction, Tollefson 2019. As found in a 2012 meta-analysis of wildlife research, so looking into the actual way we analyze conservation, while the annual amount of research done on wildlife populations is growing steadily, the actual distribution of species being analyzed is heavily skewed in the direction of birds and mammals, with amphibians, fish, and plants frequently trailing behind, Magel et al. I wanted to study frogs specifically because we very frequently do not look at herps in general, reptiles, amphibians, either or. And I thought that it would be helpful to kind of look at why we might not necessarily study them. While I was looking for other studies on the matter, I noticed that a lot of people specifically struggled with data acquisition and finding good, usable data. Largely because frogs are famously good at hiding. It is one of their major evolutionary traits that they are very good at finding places that they can blend in, A, camouflage, but B, their actual habitat regions. The way that they populate them, typically through burrows, is really difficult to find and actually identify. Also, due to the shape of a frog, for lack of a better term, it is difficult to band one. They are pretty good at getting bands off of their legs, so it's difficult to distinguish between frogs and tell them apart, meaning that we tend to get rough numbers at best with frog studies. Also, I found that for a lot of GIS studies that were done on frogs, they did not necessarily look at the frog populations themselves. They looked at the regions and how regions had changed, basically whether or not we were encouraging or discouraging frog populations, which frankly would have been a much more efficient way to go about this study. But the way that I chose to go about it was fairly straightforward. First, I collected census and population data, which is readily available. This was the easiest thing to find within the state of Florida, as well as observations of American bullfrogs from the public science resource iNaturalist. I found data ranging from 1974 to 2024, the year that this study is being conducted, and I ended up electing to trim that to just 2003 to 2024 for the sake of conciseness. There are several issues with taking data from iNaturalist that I'll get to later in this presentation, specifically when discussing my results. I also got land use data created by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection in order to demonstrate urbanized zones and wildlife applicable areas. The spreadsheet of bullfrog observations that I got from iNaturalist was converted into a point-type shapefile using the XY table to point tool, and these points were aggregated into a density raster using the point density tool. All layers were then limited to a band of counties in mid-latitude Florida, specifically high-population counties. The cities of Tampa and Orlando fall into this region, which is why I picked it. And then all layers were brought together, compacted into one layer for readability and conciseness. And then frog observations were stratified by the year of observation, which is when I realized something that was critically wrong with iNaturalist's data. Again, I'll get to it in a moment. And the density data was then overlaid with the other compacted data, and land use data was brought in to draw comparisons. So looking at the resulting maps that I got, This is my population map overlaid with the frog observation map. You'll notice that Hillsborough and Orange County have the highest human population. Those are the counties for Tampa and Orlando, respectively. Polk County also has a pretty high population, and Pasco County has a high population. But what should be noted is that in these counties, Polk, the population is largely to the south, something that I did not represent in this shapefile, unfortunately. And Pasco, the population is largely to the west, towards the coast. In that middle region, there's actually a large wildlife preserve, which is part of it is something that will be observed in a minute, but you'll notice that there's a distinct lack of frog observations in this area. Moving on and comparing this to the bullfrog observation hotspots, you'll see that, again, we have these two major notable hotspots towards Orlando and Tampa, and a couple of hotspots in wilderness areas, but largely the higher human population is, the higher the observations that we're seeing. And finally, overlaying it with the land use, something that I did not realize at the time of the study, one of those two hotspots actually coincides with Walt Disney World. Not perfectly, parts of it are still in the greater city of Orlando, but a large amount of that is Walt Disney, which I just thought was interesting. But again, places with high human populations, we see higher observations of American bullfrogs, which I will note I selected the American bullfrog because it has a good tolerance for brackish water, which made it fitting for Florida as a study site. Now, the major thing that I realized upon looking at the data here, and I discussed this in my results, is that there is a distinct skew of population observations in two directions. A, if we look at the years that the frogs are observed, there's barely any in 2003 to 2008, only 8. There's another 8 from 2009 to 2014, but then there's this exponential gain going into the time span of 2015 to 2020. There's 159 observed frogs, and again in 2021 to current, there's 287. So we see this exponential gain as the decades move on, or half decades in this case, which I do not believe can be attributed to a change in the population of frogs. Rather, I think that this is representative of a change in the population of humans who have phones. iNaturalist functions by people submitting their own observations of frogs and submitting images that they have taken of frogs, which is something that would increase exponentially as a byproduct of the number of people with cell phones or portable cameras increasing. Subsequently, same kind of idea. I think that there is a large skew. The reason that we see these hotspots in big urban areas is not because there are more frogs there, but because people are living here and therefore are more probable to see the frogs. In theory, there should be a more even distribution of frogs across that wilderness area in between the two in Lake County, but the comparative lack of frogs in that region suggests that there is a skew in the data produced by people just not going out into the wilderness to observe frogs. They are recording whenever they see them, like on their commute to work or when they are walking downtown. Also, there is, of course, the issue that the large amount of the population, even if they have access to a phone, is not necessarily aware of iNaturalist and going to be trying to look for or take pictures of frogs. This is an issue that I actually noticed in another study. It was a study conducted in Australia where they used public science and they had people record frog songs. So anytime frogs were croaking, singing at night, people would record the audio to their phones, upload it to a URL, and then later professional scientists would identify the frog species based on the song and get a general area of where these frogs were present. What I noted was that the problem with public science like this is that it creates an availability heuristic where you are documenting where frogs are, not necessarily where frogs aren't. So you can only really demonstrate the presence of frogs and cannot necessarily say anything about the absence because you aren't necessarily looking in the places where they are absent. That is the large issue here. So, looking at my results and conclusions, there is, of course, an observable trend of a deep correlation between counties with a high population density for humans and bullfrog observations within the study area. The second observable trend is that there's an increase in the number of observations reported on any given year, as I mentioned. There is an exponential gain from 8 all the way up to 250 plus. There is an exponential growth, again, and this is largely... The increase starts to blow up, especially after the renaissance of the iPhone, yes, but especially after the modern iPhones with actual quality cameras. And there's a correlation I would like to study, but do not necessarily have the resources nor the time, of whether or not there's a correlation between this and the increase in cell towers and cell tower availability. Basically, whether or not people being able to more readily access that data on the go increases their propensity to upload the data. Unfortunately, that is outside of the scope of this project and outside of the scope of what I am capable of doing, but given more time and more people, I would love to delve deeper into this and try to construct a model that can more accurately demonstrate how the population of people with access to technology might modify how this data is uploaded and accessible. Which, in my conclusions, I recognize that looking at the data alone, it does go against the hypothesis that I had that as human population and urbanization increases, frog populations will decrease. Looking at the data alone, the data goes against my hypothesis, I recognize, but I do truly believe that the issue here is availability, and I do not think that you can take this data and with any confidence make a conclusive statement either way, simply because I think that the accessibility of technology, the accessibility of smartphones, creates an illusion that the frog population is growing while it could actually be stagnant or shrinking, and we would not be able to properly represent that looking at this data alone. Additionally, I was not able to find land use data over time. I was only able to find this one instance, so I cannot truly represent my hypothesis of whether or not the population is changing in response to land usage. I was only really able to look at population. So given a larger team, given more time, given that I was not working on multiple finals at the same time, if in an ideal situation, I would like to conduct the study again with more data on land usage, more data on population change, better data on frog population without the availability heuristic present due to the public science nature of the data that I used. And I would like to conduct all this again much more carefully, using statistical analyses especially to try to demonstrate whether or not the availability of data is creating what looks to be a growth, or if it is truly the frogs growing, which I would love for the frogs to be growing, but I just do not think it's possible to create a conclusive statement given the data present. Thank you.